Today, I'm going to tell two totally insane medical mystery stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is feeling down, give them a Jack-in-the-Box toy to cheer them up. But make sure you don't give them a normal Jack-in-the-Box. Instead, give them one that's filled with angry hornets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On November 2nd, 1848, a German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bureau was just opening up his private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. When the doctor asked, what does the boy need? The teenager would say, well, the boy is honking like a goose. For a second, Dr. von Bureau thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face, and he could tell he was very upset and very serious. So the doctor grabbed his bag, and he ran outside with the teenager, and they hailed a horse and carriage, and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bureau and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. And as she led the doctor through the home towards her son's bedroom, she explained what was going on. She said her 12-year-old son had been outside playing with his friends when suddenly he had developed this really intense coughing fit, kind of out of nowhere. And then finally, when the coughing stopped and the boy tried to breathe in, his throat made this horrible honking sound. And so her boy had come in the house honking with every breath, and so kind of in a panic, the mother had opened up her son's mouth and looked inside, but she hadn't seen anything, and she knew her son was not sick. There were no other symptoms really at all that were concerning about her son. It was just that he was honking. Now, for a while, the mother thought this would just kind of clear up, that maybe it was just kind of some byproduct of coughing really, really hard. But now it had been 18 hours and the boy was still honking with nearly every breath, which is why she had finally told the teen to go get the doctor. When the mother let Dr. von Bureau into her son's bedroom and he got a look at the honking boy, he couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor watched him try to breathe in, not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. So it was more than the sound, it looked like he was suffocating. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy and told him to open up his mouth. The boy did, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard, and he couldn't quite grab it. So he grabbed his forceps, which are kind of like big tweezers, and he reached back into the boy's mouth and he tried to grab this object that was clearly obstructing his throat, but the object was too slippery and the doctor could not pull it out. And so the doctor is looking at this boy who's obviously struggling to breathe, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't get in there and get this obstruction out, this kid is going to die. And so the doctor made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in. But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And so the doctor pulled out his scalpel and he performed the tracheotomy on this boy. He opened up his throat, and when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object in the doctor's hand, having no idea how to react to this because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat that was making him honk like a goose was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason, and on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he had this gooseneck in front of his mouth, and so when he inhaled suddenly, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat. Luckily, the honking boy would make a full recovery. If you're watching this video, then chances are good you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And if that's true, then you're in luck. Because we, Ballen Studios, just released a brand new strange, dark, and mysterious podcast called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, we'll explore new, bizarre, unheard of diseases, miraculous recoveries, strange medical mishaps, and everything in between. And like all other shows that I host, each episode of Medical Mysteries will end with a big plot twist. Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries is available on all podcast platforms, and it is 100% free. But if you happen to listen to it on Amazon Music, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. But on all the other podcast platforms, we just put out 1 episode a week. And then once they catch up to where Amazon Music is, we drop another new 8 episodes on Amazon Music, but continue doing 1 per each week on every other platform. The next 8 episode binge on Amazon Music is scheduled for Tuesday, January 30th. So be sure you go check out Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts. And make sure you stick around till the end of this YouTube video, because we're going to play a sneak peek of this coming Tuesday's brand new episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, which is called The Curse of Veneto. On the afternoon of February 1st, 2013, a retired Army veteran named Robert Smith limped his way into the emergency room at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Robert checked in at the triage desk, but then instead of sitting down with the rest of the patients who were waiting, he leaned up against the wall and just grimaced. Robert was in his late 60s, and up until just a few days ago, he felt like he was in the best health he had been in since leaving the service. Robert had gotten a kidney transplant a year and a half earlier, and after getting that operation, he really wanted to make sure he stayed healthy, and so he had been going on regular walks and eating healthy, and so really he was doing great. But a few days ago, Robert had noticed this throbbing pain in his right hip that was shooting pain all the way down his right leg. And he assumed, this had to be from maybe overdoing it on one of his walks. But the pain had continued to get worse and worse over the last few days. And so that was why he was finally here at the hospital. A nurse eventually called Robert's name, and so Robert, he came off the wall and hobbled over to her, and she led him down a hallway into an exam room. Once they got inside the room, the nurse would take Robert's vitals, which were all normal, and then after doing that, she said she was going to go out and get the doctor. A couple minutes later, the doctor walked into the room, and she reviewed Robert's chart and talked to Robert about his symptoms, and then afterwards, she concluded that very likely what Robert had was something called sciatica. Sciatica is pain caused by pressure on the sciatic nerve, which travels from the lower back down each leg. And while sciatica is definitely very uncomfortable and very painful, it's not usually a big deal, and it typically clears up on its own without treatment. And so the doctor told Robert that he should just go pick up some ibuprofen, so over-the-counter pain medication, and take that every couple of hours and just wait for this thing to pass, and then he'd be fine. And so Robert was totally relieved. He thanked the doctor, he thanked the nurse, and then he left and headed back to his home. But despite doing what the doctor said and taking pain meds and just kind of taking it easy, the pain in Robert's leg did not go away. And then on the morning of February 4th, so 3 days after Robert's trip to the ER, he woke up and not only was his right hip and leg still sore, but now when he tried to stand up, he couldn't put any weight on his right leg. It just felt too weak and it was kind of tingly. Something just felt off about it. And also Robert felt very nauseous. And so Robert told himself that, maybe what was going on here is he was taking too much ibuprofen and it was upsetting his stomach, and maybe it was also affecting his leg negatively or something. He didn't know. And so that day he just sat on the couch and watched TV trying to tell himself that he was okay. It's just sciatica, take a little less pain meds and you'll be okay. But that didn't work, because the next day when he woke up, he was in even worse shape. Now, he not only had this pain and weakness in his right leg, and he had nausea still, but also he now had this new pain in his abdomen that was located right around where the scar was from his kidney transplant, and Robert was also starting to spike a fever. And fevers in transplant patients are a really big deal, because a fever in a transplant patient could mean an infection. People who get transplants are then given medication that keep their bodies from rejecting their new organ or organs. This medication works by basically suppressing that person's immune system. This prevents the body from mistakenly attacking the new organ, but it also means that if their body gets a real infection, they will have a really hard time fighting it off, because again, this medicine is basically stopping the immune system. And so when Robert saw he had a fever in conjunction with these other symptoms that were not going away, he knew he had to go back to the hospital, because obviously this was not just sciatica. Robert was too sick and weak to drive himself to the hospital, so he asked his neighbor to drive him. And as they were driving to the hospital, Robert basically sat in the passenger seat, rocking back and forth, not saying anything because he was so uncomfortable. And the neighbor, the whole time they're driving, they just kept looking over at Robert, because not only did Robert look totally miserable, but also Robert was sweating profusely, like so much so that it looked like he had just sprinted a 5K. I mean, he was drenched in sweat. And so the neighbors looking at him thinking, like, what's wrong with this guy? Finally, the neighbor arrived at the hospital, and Robert, he managed to get out on his own, and he thanked the neighbor, and then Robert hobbled his way back through the doors into the ER. And then a few minutes later, Robert was in an exam room, and his doctor walked in, and she took one look at him and saw how horrible he looked, and without any hesitation, she said, "You're getting admitted right now." It was clear to Robert's doctors that he had some kind of virus or infection that his body was trying and failing to fight off. When they tested his blood, they saw his white blood cell count was elevated, which is a sign that the body's immune system is launching some kind of a response. But the doctors didn't know what his immune system was responding to. Even though Robert had this acute pain in his abdomen around the site of the kidney transplant, his kidneys seemed to be working just fine. And so whatever was going on with him didn't seem to be linked to his transplant. The profuse sweating did seem pretty odd, but considering Robert had a really high fever, it wasn't totally inexplicable. So basically, Robert's symptoms were weird, but kind of generic. They didn't tell the doctors specifically what was wrong with him. They just knew something was wrong. So they just hooked Robert up to an IV and began administering a broad spectrum antibiotic, which is something that treats a whole variety of different infections. And then after that, the doctors just began testing Robert over and over and over again for all these different things that could be the cause for his illness. But every test they ran came back negative. And at the same time, over the couple of weeks that they ran all these tests, Robert just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. His fever wasn't going away, he was still sweating profusely, his blood pressure was all over the map, and he had even begun drooling almost uncontrollably to the point where he didn't even speak because he was so embarrassed about it. But to the doctors, the scariest symptom that Robert was now showing 2 weeks into staying at the hospital was he was starting to act really confused. Like he didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he was there. And so that told the doctors that, whatever his body was fighting, it had made its way up into his brain. And so the doctors knew, Robert did not have much time left, but they had tried every test they could think of, and Robert had tested negative for all of them. And so, as kind of like a Hail Mary, because they had nothing to lose, the medical staff decided to just start testing Robert for basically completely random diseases that he almost certainly did not have. But basically, if any of these illnesses had a symptom that Robert had, they would test him for it. And all these tests came back negative, except for one. On February 22nd, so 17 days after Robert had been admitted to the hospital, this test came back positive, and when the doctors saw what he was testing positive for, they immediately assumed this has to be a mistake. There is no way he has that. However, the only way to truly confirm that diagnosis was to literally cut into Robert's brain, which would kill him. And so obviously they were not going to do that. So the doctors basically just had to take this diagnosis at face value, and they tried giving various medications to Robert, but it was obvious none of them were working. And so the doctors felt like there wasn't much they could do, and they just began focusing instead on keeping Robert comfortable. And then finally, on February 27th, so 22 days into Robert's stay at the hospital, he would die from this mystery illness. During Robert's autopsy, the medical examiner was able to perform that test that doctors could not perform on him when he was alive, and that was to cut into his brain. And when the doctor cut into his brain, he saw very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that yes, Robert really was positive for that very, very rare virus, and it absolutely is the thing that killed him. But this was not the end of the case, because the virus that killed Robert was not just rare, it was also highly contagious, which meant the doctors needed to figure out how Robert got this virus to protect other people from getting it too. But the staff at this hospital knew they were not equipped to lead this investigation, and so they handed the case over to the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, which is the world's leading disease tracking agency. Investigators for the CDC began looking into Robert's case a couple of days later. They sifted through the days and the weeks leading up to Robert's hospitalization in an effort to try to retrace Robert's footsteps to figure out what made him sick. Now, they didn't have any leads. The only thing they agreed on was that very likely, even though Robert had that pain around his scar where the transplant was, that very likely the transplant did not have to do with whatever killed him, because Robert's kidney had been working fine and his transplant had happened 17 months earlier, and typically complications from transplants will happen much sooner. And so they basically had ruled the transplant out as being the cause. But one of the CDC investigators decided to look into the transplant file anyways, just to see if maybe something got missed, or if maybe there was some detail about the donor that was relevant to what happened to Robert. And so this investigator got the file and began going through it. Robert's donor's name was William Edward Small, and at the time of his death, he was 20 years old and serving in the Air Force. Now, none of that stood out to the CDC investigator, but William's cause of death definitely did. Even though it really did not appear to have a connection to Robert, it was just so weird and unexpected. The CDC investigator would read that back in September of 2011, William was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and he caught a fish, and he ate that fish, and it gave him something called ciguatera poisoning. Ciguatera poisoning is something you get when you eat a fish that contains microalgae toxins. And so William, he ate this fish that was contaminated, and not long after that, he had died. But when the CDC investigator read through all of William's symptoms before he died, they basically exactly lined up with all of Robert's symptoms. William had developed pain and weakness in his extremities. He developed a very high fever. He became nauseous. He also lost the ability to swallow, and then he became totally confused and then died. And so when the CDC investigators saw this incredible coincidence, she knew she was onto something, but first she would need more information about William. And so very quickly, the CDC got in touch with William's family, and they asked them all these questions about William. And finally, after hearing the answers from the family, the CDC finally figured out what actually happened to Robert and what actually happened to William. It would turn out William was not just a fisherman, he was also a hunter and a trapper. And he had a very specific way he would go about training his hunting dogs. He would capture wild raccoons and use them as live bait to train his hunting dogs how to hunt. Now, William was always very cautious with these wild raccoons, but in the year and a half leading up to his death, he was bit 2 different times by raccoons. And it was one of those 2 raccoon bites, not some toxic fish in the Gulf of Mexico, that killed William and killed Robert. William did not die from ciguatera poisoning. He died from rabies, and the rabies virus that was in his kidney was still present when it was taken out of his dead body and transplanted into Robert's body. And so that was how Robert got rabies. Rabies can look like the common flu at first, People feel achy and nauseous, they get fevers, their stomach starts to hurt. Some people affected by rabies will drool uncontrollably, like Robert, or they'll lose the ability to swallow, like William. But for everybody who contracts rabies and who does not get a vaccine right away, because a vaccine does stop rabies in the early stage, so if you don't do that, everybody dies. That's what rabies does to you. It kills you. Now, you'd think, maybe we should be testing organs for rabies before they get transplanted, but you gotta remember that rabies is so rare. Only 1 or 2 people a year in the entire United States will die from rabies. And so it's just not something doctors are going to screen for, because the percentage chance that they could have rabies is basically 0. Ultimately, Robert was not the only person who received an organ transplant from William. There were 3 other people that received his organs. Luckily, though, the CDC was able to track those 3 people down, and all of them were totally healthy and not showing any signs of rabies, so either they didn't have it or they were super early stage, which meant they were eligible for the rabies vaccine. They all got the vaccine, and they lived happily ever after. On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of 3 had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death, and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived, because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis or fibromyalgia or MS or heart failure or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, "I think I have Lyme disease," they said, "Yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you." And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. You know, even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, you know, with these bee stings, I'm gonna have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's gonna take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease. I am so excited to announce that we here at Ballen Studios have a brand new show that is live right now for free on all podcast platforms. It's called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, and as you might have guessed, it's about medical mysteries. Take, for example, the very first episode of the show called Ashes to Ashes. It's about this adult son who goes to check on his father who lives in the woods by himself. And when he gets to his dad's house, he goes inside and the power's off and there's this weird gooey substance on everything, the furniture, the walls, food everywhere. And the son, he calls out for his dad. He can't see his dad doesn't call back. And so the son leaves and gets help. And when help arrives, they search his father's house and they find something in the very back of the house that is far more bizarre and shocking than the gooey substance on the walls. Their discovery would quickly become one of the most talked about medical mysteries of all time. Again, this story is called Ashes to Ashes. It's episode number 1 on Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, which is a podcast that is new and free and available everywhere. New episodes of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries will come out every Tuesday, but if you have no patience and you just want to listen to a whole bunch of episodes right now, you can listen to 8 episodes of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music. Again, the show is called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, and it's available right now everywhere for free. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016, 13-year-old Shoaib Ahmed and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased a soccer ball across the dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line drive shot right at the net, but at the last second the goalie jumped and blocked the shot. And so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation, but even though he was frustrated he missed a shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother, Shoaib, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shoaib was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand, and the two brothers, without a word to their friends who were just kind of standing there watching, they took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shoaib, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw locking up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed, with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shoaib off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up. And then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him. And then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shoaib and Abdul lived. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences, and they had heard about the boy's nightly bizarre collapses, and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shoaib still in their beds in a semi-comatose state, unable to move. But it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside, goofing around and playing, acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shoaib as the solar boys because they were only normal and active and like the other kids during the daylight hours when the sun was up. And then at night, they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now, the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a grift to get people to donate money to the family. But Shoaib and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientists would talk to Abdul and Shoaib's father first, and he would explain to them that really since Abdul and Shoaib were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so with the family's permission, these scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shoaib and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also, the scientists tested Abdul and Shoaib's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shoaib slowly lost control of their bodies and became paralyzed and mute. And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. Then, the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up, and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shoaib were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around, no problem. And so to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this. Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal and they had passed all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shoaib should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't. And These scientists didn't know why. Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the Solar Kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shoaib had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed. And so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water. But that didn't work, and so the family was close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons. But then in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, a TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about this strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the vice chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, it was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys, but they were very convinced that this was a real condition. And so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them, and he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shoaib, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad, and that night, Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Akram gave each of the boys a pill. And 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mute and laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg. And then Shoaib, right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shoaib. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shoaib was just a dopamine pill, and what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too, and so Abdul and Shoaib, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night. On the evening of July 3rd, 1992, 35-year-old George Decker was cooking in the kitchen inside of the apartment that he shared with his girlfriend in Jasper, Indiana. And as George cooked, he began to cough. At first, George thought it was just a little tickle in his throat that would go away, but as he continued to cough, this feeling, this sensation in his throat that was making him cough was only getting worse and worse. And this cough was not a normal cough. It was a deep, guttural, kind of rough-sounding cough that really hurt as he did it, and it kind of scared George, like he had never heard himself make this sound before. And in the other room, George's girlfriend, Juanita, she heard this very odd-sounding cough, and so she came out into the kitchen to see what was going on. And when she got there, she found George leaning on the counter, barely able to catch his breath because he was coughing so much. And this was totally out of character for George. He wasn't sick. He didn't have some sort of respiratory problem. He didn't smoke cigarettes. He did work in a metal shop where he melted down aluminum and poured it into different molds, but he always followed all the safety precautions. He wore a mask. He did all the things you're supposed to do to make sure he didn't inhale anything toxic. And so there was really no good reason why George would suddenly be having this unbelievable coughing fit. And so as Juanita kept asking George, hey, are you okay? Can I do anything? George, he can't even talk. He just pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and he put it over his mouth as he continued to cough. And then when he pulled the handkerchief away, it was clearly covered in blood. Now, George was quick to kind of put the handkerchief back in his pocket, not wanting to deal with the fact that he was coughing up blood. But Juanita, she saw the blood and said, okay, George, I don't know what's going on, but you are going to the hospital right now. Now, George, even though he couldn't talk because he was coughing so much, clearly did not want to go. And he kind of resisted Juanita pretty aggressively. He did not want to go. But Juanita finally grabbed him and literally dragged him through the house, out the front door, and down into their car. And then just a few moments later, they were on their way to the hospital located a few miles away. By the time they actually parked in front of the emergency room at this hospital, George's cough had actually died down a little bit. And so now George was being really insistent that it was totally pointless to go to the hospital, that they did not need to be here. Take me back home. This is ridiculous. But Juanita really pressed him and said, you can't goof around with coughing up blood. You have to go in there. And so finally, George, who was totally annoyed by this, relented. He got out of the car and the two of them walked to the hospital. And then when they went in the front doors of this emergency room, a nurse came up to greet them and see what was going on. And George kind of inexplicably pushed the nurse, like, to get away from me. I don't need your help. And Juanita, she was so embarrassed and tried to apologize, and the staff just kind of rolled with it and just kind of gave him his space. And then for the rest of the time they were there, the staff basically only talked to Juanita, while George sat in the corner with his arms crossed, unwilling to talk or give them any information. Toward the end of this hospital visit, the doctor would prescribe George some antibiotics for what he called an upper respiratory infection, and then the doctor asked George if he was willing to stay the night so they could observe him and make sure he really was okay. But George flatly refused. He got up, turned around, and practically ran out of the hospital. And Juanita said, "I'm so sorry," and she followed after him. Over the next couple of days, George would take these antibiotics that he was prescribed, but they really did not make a difference. He continued to have these huge coughing fits, and even worse than that, something Juanita noticed was George's skin was clearly turning blue, in particular on his arms, his hands, his fingertips, and on his face. And so finally, about a week after that first visit to the ER, Juanita, she looked at George and just felt like he looks so bad. He has to go back. They have to check him again. And so Juanita was able to, again, convince George to go to the hospital. He was very resistant to the idea, but now he was so physically weakened and drained from whatever was going on, he just kind of went with whatever Juanita wanted. And this time, when they went to the hospital, they would give George a chest x-ray, and it would reveal George had pneumonia in both of his lungs. This explained why he was coughing so much, and it also explained why his skin was turning blue. Because of this infection in his lungs, his body was not getting enough oxygen, and when that happens, it leads to a condition known as cyanosis, which turns your skin blue. But when doctors tried to figure out what was actually causing George's pneumonia, they immediately ran into a brick wall. Usually, pneumonia is caused by bacteria, viruses, or some other microscopic invader, and doctors can test a patient's mucus to determine which one it is. But when they tested George's mucus, they couldn't find any evidence of anything that would cause pneumonia. The doctors also ruled out aluminum pollution because he did work in a metal plant and could have been inhaling the aluminum when he melted it down, but he was negative for that. And then also doctors began looking into all these crazy other possibilities like strange fungus that maybe George had come in contact with that caused this, or, very rare viruses and bacteria. But no matter what the doctors thought of, when they tested George, it would come back negative. And so, with the exception of his x-ray that clearly showed he had pneumonia, every other test they ran on George made it seem like he was a healthy guy. And so George would spend weeks in the hospital with doctors and nurses constantly trying to figure out what was wrong with him, but not succeeding. And as each day went by, George's condition got worse and worse until finally he was put on a ventilator because his lungs actually just didn't work on their own. And so a ventilator basically forces air into the patient's body. But no matter how much oxygen they pumped into George's body, he continued to have these terrible coughing fits and his skin stayed blue. Finally, in October, so 3 months after George had first developed this coughing fit, he would pass away. George's doctors were totally baffled. It did not make sense what had happened to George. He was young and healthy, and then something that was totally powerful and aggressive had wiped him out. And so the doctors knew they needed to figure out what that thing was and how to cure it before other people died from the same mystery illness. On October 8th, so 5 days after George passed away, an Indiana pathologist named Dr. Daniel C. Weaver, who was known for his ability to figure out unexplained deaths like George's, was called to the hospital where George died to perform George's autopsy. And when Dr. Weaver began the autopsy and looked inside of George, he could not believe how just absolutely ruined George's lungs were. Healthy lungs are sort of like cotton candy. The tissue is light and airy, which is perfect for transferring the oxygen we breathe throughout our bodies. But George's lungs were thick and heavy, and they were lumpy with scar tissue. They were totally useless. And so Dr. Weaver knew, George basically suffocated to death. But now the question was, why? Dr. Weaver would run into the same obstacles as all the other doctors when he attempted to find contamination inside of George's lungs. There was nothing to see. In fact, at the end of the autopsy, Dr. Weaver had basically learned nothing as to why this happened to George. In frustration, after this autopsy was over, Dr. Weaver went to George's medical records and just began reading through them, and it was at this point that he saw something very odd that other doctors clearly had seen too, but they must have thought it was not important. At that very first ER visit, Juanita had told nurses and doctors that George, before he had begun coughing in the kitchen, he had been in a great mood. And generally speaking, George was just a very positive and upbeat person. But she said once he started coughing, it was like he transformed into somebody else and became mean and nasty. And Juanita had to practically drag him to the hospital. And then also there was a note in the file about how George had walked through the doors and pushed that admissions nurse. And so Dr. Weaver thought to himself, maybe George's belligerence was not just him being a jerk, but maybe he had ingested something toxic that was affecting obviously his lungs and also his brain, and that was causing him to behave this way. And so Dr. Weaver called the manager of the metal shop where George had worked to try to ask him if there were other chemicals or toxins inside of the plant that maybe George had been exposed to. But the manager just did not want to talk about any of that. Instead, he just wanted to talk about basically how awful George was as a person. The manager clearly did not like George, and he began talking about how George was obsessed with making money at all costs, and that in addition to working in the metal plant, George had all these kind of sketchy, kind of borderline illegal side jobs to make more money. And then at some point, the manager just began talking about this one particular potential scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of silver and gold. And the doctor at this point is not really even listening. He just wants to get off the phone with this guy because it's obvious the manager is not really trying to help. He's just trying to bash George. But at some point, the manager, in detailing this gold and silver scam, mentioned something that piqued the doctor's interest. And suddenly the doctor was really intently listening to this manager and actually began taking notes and asking clarifying questions about this particular scam that George was apparently involved in. And then when Dr. Weaver hung up the phone with this manager, he felt pretty confident that he had actually figured out what had happened to George. The clues had all been there the whole time. George's blue skin and his rude and violent behavior at the ER, but nobody had put them together correctly because the cause of what was happening to George was so weird, no one would have ever thought of it on their own. On the night that George first began coughing in the kitchen, he was not cooking dinner like everybody assumed. He was actually cooking teeth, like human teeth. The metal shop manager told Dr. Weaver on the phone about the scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of gold and silver. And the manager explained to Dr. Weaver that George was going to all of these local dentist offices and he was collecting all of their discarded teeth. What George wanted was teeth that had fillings in them because some of the fillings, especially for older patients, were made from gold and silver. George would then literally cook the teeth until he was able to extract the gold and silver. Now, if he had just been cooking teeth with gold fillings, he'd probably still be alive. But because George also was cooking the teeth with silver in them, during that process of cooking the silver teeth, mercury gas was released and George would inhale the gas. And mercury gas is deadly. And so the gas went into George, it ravaged his lungs, and it also created these massive mood swings and mental disturbances, which explained why he became so nasty and mean when he got to the ER. Also, ingesting high levels of silver, which George was doing as well, can turn your skin blue. So in the end, George did not die from pneumonia, he died from mercury poisoning. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's medical mystery stories, be sure to tune in to our brand new podcast called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries that is available wherever you get your podcasts right now. Again, it's called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries.